One Less God Than You by John DeRosa. Welcome everyone to Polycarp's Paradigm. My name is Eric Robinson, and have the privilege today of interviewing John DeRosa, who's been on the show several times with Pat Flynn and I. We did a round table of the three of us, got into a lot of interesting discussions about God, apologetics, and all that. Welcome, John, to our first ever session one-on-one on Polycarp's Paradigm.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's great to be back on the show. I had a blast with those roundtables with you and Pat.
Yes. And for those of you who don't know, John runs a podcast called Classical Theism, and he's about to release, or it may already be out, his new book, One Less God Than You. John, if you wouldn't mind just giving a brief introduction on yourself and how you came to write this book and jumping
Sure.
into that.
Yeah. So no, I'm a Catholic living in New Jersey. I'm also a math teacher for my day job, but I've always been interested in studying Catholic Christian ideas. And over the years, I was kind of compiling a lot of atheistic slogans that I kept hearing. And so eventually I actually got a tip from a friend. He's like, why don't you compile these into a book? And so that's what I did. And the book is for Catholics who want to have better conversations with atheists or skeptics. And in particular, I'll tell you this, I always like to tell the story. I was a chaperone at a confirmation retreat at my parish for ninth
Yes.
graders. And I'll tell you, in that seventh, eighth, ninth grade years, that's when students are going to start to really, question things and want to think deeply about their faith. And a lot of those people, they're hearing these type of slogans from their peers. Even like in the small group I was running, like one of the students who said he was an atheist and was giving these types of slogans and so forth. And I think it's important, all Catholics, not every Catholic is going to study the nitty gritty philosophical details and get PhDs and all of that. But I think every Catholic should have something to say about the popular issues of the day, and particularly
Yes.
if they're working with young people, their own kids, or people in their parish, they want to be able to at least have something to say to answer some of these slogans. So what I did is I started out with 10 of them on my website. It was like an ebook, and then it was 12, and then it was 13, and then now it's up to 20. So I kind of just kept
Wow.
adding to the list over time, and then this book will kind of take you through and show you how to answer them.
Wow. So how long has this been in the making, would you
Yeah, I
say?
guess, well, right when I started the podcast, so probably about 2.5 years ago, that's when I started the PDF of it. And then I just kind of kept adding to it um,
Wow.
as I could think of them and see them. And what's crazy is some of these slogans, and here's the thing, people who have been in this conversation and so forth, they might say, oh, well, some of these, these aren't the strongest arguments. And even the title, like, I believe in one less God than you do, comes from a popular objection. That's not the strongest objection to religion, but
Right.
these are really the ones that people are hearing. And, you might be at a family event, you might be, again, like in a CCD class, even younger
Right.
students, and you want to be at least conversant with these. And I'll tell you what, I was listening to Richard Dawkins on Joe Rogan's podcast the other day. And Dawkins has a popular book out called Outgrowing God. And it's like for teenagers trying to like convert them to, atheism and a more
Wow.
scientist materialist worldview. And the first thing he does in that book is this one less God than you type slogan. And even on the Joe Rogan show, Joe Rogan called it a home run. So we can talk about that one and other things, but I just want people to know,
Wow.
even if these aren't like, even if they don't look to you, you look at the table of contents, oh, these aren't the strongest objections I've ever heard. They are very popular. And if every Catholic could have something to say to these, it would do a lot for showing the intellectual substance behind our faith.
Yes. Well, I love, and you sent me the table of contents, and I was just looking at it, and I was like, wow, this is awesome. Because these are the things that we hear on sometimes a daily basis, weekly basis, whatever it might be. But these are the practical, like when it comes down to it, our culture is asking these questions. And so we have to have responses. And so I'm excited to, you know, go over some of these with you and our listeners and just giving us a taste. Obviously, like the book will be out that everyone can
Yeah, and
buy.
by the way, I'll just clarify. It should by the time of this recording, I think it will be out. So, but
Yeah.
everyone can go. I'll have a link that I can give you at the end again, but it's going to be classicaltheism.com/new book, and
Okay.
that'll link you right to the page. If it's not out yet, it'll be out very soon, or by the time this recording drops, it should be out.
Awesome. And you can feel free to answer these questions, these objections that you put in your book as thoroughly or as quickly as you want. Obviously, you don't have to go through the whole chapter, but
Well, actually, before we dive into the
yeah.
individual chapters, could I give you a couple of the principles from the
Yes.
intro. Okay. These are
Yes, yes,
just really
yes.
succinctly 5 important principles I put for answering these slogans and getting to these. And this is where I got a lot of inspiration from guys like you and Pat Flynn. For the first thing is just, prayer. The first
Mm,
principle, pray every day. If you're going to be having these conversations with people and skeptics, it can sometimes bog you down. It can be disheartening. I went to that retreat. I was like, wow, I can't believe all these students, a lot of them are not taking the faith seriously at all. And it's going to be very
mm,
easily to get weighed down if you don't have a prayer life. So set aside some time, pray every day. Catechism
mhm,
has a great section on prayer. You can build that up. And you've done, a lot of great episodes where you're mentioning different things about that. So that's the first principle.
mm.
Second principle is when people are pressed with a slogan or like an objection to religious belief, they think everything weighs on them. Like if they don't come up with some super cool quick response, then the other person wins. And that's not how it works in a dialogue. So what I tell people is whenever possible, ask questions rather than make statements. So first principle, pray every day. Second principle, always start out with questions. Find out where the other person's coming from. They're a person just like us. We believe they're made in the image of God. We want to see, what exactly is at the heart of what they're saying and treat them well. So ask questions to find out more. Third, don't just let them get away with vague criticisms. That's like a basic thing with the Catholic Church. They'll be like, the Catholic Church, I just don't like it because they're against science. There's all that stuff with the Crusades. When they offer like these vague, wishy-washy criticisms, you got to get more specific. Be like, well, hey, what are you talking? What do you mean? Tell me more about this science objection. Like, don't just let them get away with vague objections. Fourth thing, apologetics, and you've been in this space for a bit, studying the difference between, specifically Catholic apologetics. You can have a type of apologetics aimed at showing the truth of theism over atheism. You can have apologetics for Christianity. Whatever level of apologetics you're talking about, I've always found it's most helpful to those who are already somewhat open to the faith.
Mm.
If you're trying to do, like, you could be like the best apologist ever. And I listen to Catholic Answers all the time, Jimmy Akin and Trent Horton. Those guys are awesome. But if you're talking to someone who's like not in any way open, you can't expect them to convert in 3 seconds because you gave some awesome argument. Like that's not how it happens. So
Yes.
part of it is, getting to know the person, moving them to a position where they can be open to the faith and showing them the value of Catholicism, the value of Christianity, and like voicing that and what we get out of our faith and our testimony and all that. So just realize that you're not going to just go out there with your, the way I phrased it on another podcast, it's not like apologetics is like the sword of Gryffindor that you could use to slay any enemy like automatically. It doesn't work like
Oh
that.
man, too
But
bad.
yeah, but I will say this: if you find someone who's seeking and who's open and who like genuinely wants to know more, I think it could be very powerful for them. And those are some of the best conversations I've had, with my college roommates and other people who showed some openness. And then we get to there. And then the fifth thing is just don't be a jerk. Don't neglect the soft skills of evangelism. When you get in apologetics, people say, you can be prone to pride, think that you have all the answers, and it doesn't work like that. So the soft skills are just like being polite, getting to know the person, praying for them, asking about them, seeing how you're doing. And you know this as well. It's a lot easier when you're friendly with someone or close to someone to talk about, some of these deeper issues. You're not going to dive into, someone's emotional pain and suffering in a first conversation if you've just met them. That's just
Mhm.
not how it works. So those are 5 principles: prayer, ask questions, don't let them get away with vague criticism. It's useful to those who are already open, and don't neglect the soft skills of
Yes.
evangelization.
That reminds me of the verse in First Peter. Always be ready to make a defense for anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that's in you. Yet, do this with gentleness and kindness, and that's so important. And it also talks about in Ephesians, speak the truth in love. And it's something that this reminds me of too is the whole idea of accompaniment. I think I'm really, really getting into that idea lately because I've had several conversations with friends that I'm like, okay, they didn't have like a full blown like conversion, but there was like a baby step in the right direction where it's like, I'm going to celebrate that. And I'm going to celebrate that with you. One of my friends recently said, and he's not a Christian at all, but we talked about Jesus' teaching about forgiveness and how if you don't forgive, like he won't forgive you. And he was like, hey, Eric, I forgave this person that really wronged me. And I just celebrate with him. It's not like he hasn't become a Christian yet or anything, but like he did that. And I was like, yes. And so I think with these conversations too, it's like, hey, if you can just crack the door open even a little more, if you can just answer a little bit more and have that relationship, have that journey with them, that's a huge thing.
No, and I love that. And one of the main questions, and I got this from a Christian apologist, Greg Kokel, is, towards the end of the conversation, you always want to offer something like, have you ever considered this? Offering something more for their consideration. And that could be a small goal. The goal is not to, convince someone and force them into submission that they just have to be a Catholic on the spot. That's just not how it works. I
Right.
love what you said with the accompaniment thing, because I see that's how God's grace works. God's grace works in the nitty gritty, subtle details of everyday life. And, small movements at the beginning, over the course of years can lead to, people growing into tremendous saints. And I think that's what our faith tells us. So I'm all about that. You're not gonna crush someone, but you're gonna have something to say for each of these slogans that can move the conversation forward.
Yes, yes. Well, are you ready for the quiz this morning?
Let's do it.
All right. Well, I kind of want to start with that title. I'm going to pretend to be the atheist, okay, or the one that's kind of open to faith, but I have these objections, John. Okay. You know what, John? I just believe in one less God than you. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, no, it's and just to give you a little more setup, I'm sure you don't believe in Zeus, you don't believe in Thor, you don't believe in, thousands of other gods, right?
Right.
That's right. And so like you probably want to be consistent, and so you just go one God further in rejecting the God of the Bible. That's how this objection is that a
Yeah.
fair, representation of your position?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we gave up all that superstitious stuff long ago, and yeah, I mean, you believe in someone maybe a little more powerful than Zeus, but that's that's not what I believe.
Yeah. So one question I have about that is, if I was going to start out asking questions, and if you want to go, I could just role play this with you and we could keep
Yeah.
doing that. But so do you think all of those gods are the same? And if so, can you explain more?
Oh, well, I mean, no, there was the goddess of love, like Aphrodite. There was the god of war, um, Aries, I think. uh, there was the hunter god, Artemis. And so, yeah, they had different functions, but Zeus was like kind of the head honcho. And he actually had relations with someone and they gave birth to Hercules. But everyone just knows that like that's just silly and that's stupid, and we know science just shows us that okay, human beings cause wars, not these gods, or love is just a human thing. It's not like this goddess Aphrodite does anything.
So that's interesting. Let me see if I follow you here, because it's interesting. You brought up science, and we could talk about that too, because that's another common thing. And I'm a Catholic, and I love science, and I think it's very important to find out more about our world. But when you were bringing up those different gods, I think I kind of follow you, and I think most people, even of those cultures, a lot of people recognize that those were stories, sometimes mythical in nature, just meant to tell something. Do you think those are, directly analogous to the Christian God, or to the, the God of the Jews, or Muslims? Would you say like those are all kind of put them all in the same box, or if not, what makes them different?
Gosh, John, that's a good question.
So
I
just
just
to interrupt, like this is kind of what I would do in a conversation, right? Like you're just
yeah,
asking questions. At this point, I'm not trying to show the person, oh, that's a stupid objection that's been answered hundreds of times. Like answer,
yeah,
like ask questions, let them explain. And another place I might go with this is to get this principle on the table. Like I agree with you. Like I don't believe in some of those gods, but does lack of evidence for some gods, that doesn't necessarily imply that there's no evidence for any god. That's like a kind of like, would you agree with that principle in general? Like just because we don't have evidence for some of the gods, that doesn't mean that there's no evidence for any god. And then I would try to point out, the God of Islam, of Christianity, and the Jewish religion, he's not really like those other gods of pagan mythologies, like that you mentioned, that they have relations with other deities and so forth. The God of classical theism is not like the finite, mutable gods of other religions. We do believe in that he's like the creator of all the universe, and we could talk
mm,
about some evidence for that. But I just wanted to point out that you can absolutely be consistent in dismissing some conceptions of God, but also thinking there's good evidence for a more classical view of God. And if they still didn't buy that, here's another analogy I really like to use just to press it further. Suppose like there's a crime committed. And you might have heard Pat Flynn gives this one too. This is like a good analogy I stole from him. Suppose there's like a crime committed, like a diamond necklace is stolen. The police round up a bunch of different suspects and they're like, okay, did this guy do it? Now he's got an alibi. Did this guy do it? Now he was seen over here. And they just dismiss like, okay, they rule it out. Like none of these 12 suspects could have been the culprit who stole the diamond necklace. So then they pull in some other guy who, it's kind of looking like he's it. But one of the detectives gives this sort of objection. He's like, guys, come on, we just dismissed all of these other suspects. We said none of them could have stole the necklace. So, I just believe in one less culprit than you do. Obviously, this necklace wasn't stolen. So would that be a logical conclusion from this detective? And I think we would have to say, no, just because you ruled out a dozen or more suspects doesn't mean there was no crime committed. And bring the analogy over to theism for a moment. Just because you've ruled out some gods as, not really having evidence, as being part of a mythical or pagan culture, that doesn't mean that there's no evidence for any God. And we would point to creation itself, the beginning of the universe, the fine tuning of the universe, and we can get into some of that other evidence, which I do in an appendix, to show that there actually are good reasons to believe in the God of classical theism. So that's how I would kind of start the conversation off with questions, and then I would go to those analogies and principles.
Yeah, that's great. And yeah, I'll kind of keep role playing here as well, and jump into a different one here. John, it's just that there's so many other religions. Like, the Greeks had their gods, the Romans had their gods. Sure, maybe there's a difference between the Christian God, the Muslim God, than those other gods. But you know what? If I was born in Saudi Arabia, I'd be Muslim. Objection 18 there.
Yeah, so I think I hear what you're saying, but just help me understand a little bit more. Are you saying that because like where you're born impacts so much about religion that therefore it's not true? Something like that?
Yeah, it's just, we really are in a lot of ways a product of our own environment. So, if Christianity, let's say, was the only true religion, which I find highly unlikely, then why would that be the case? Like, what in the world happens when you're born in a context that's like completely Muslim and you're just a Muslim because that was your context? Like, what? It seems to me that shows that truth is really just relative based on the culture, and we shouldn't put one religion above the other.
You're making some very important points, and I definitely agree with you that our background and how we're raised does impact our beliefs and what we hold. But well, let me see if this question will kind of help what I'm getting at. And if you don't like the question, we can go. I'll just tell you what I'm getting at, but I think this will kind of help elucidate something. Let me just ask you. You say if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you'd be a Muslim. I'm just curious. Do you believe in equal rights for human beings? Like, do you believe in equal rights for women, for people who are homosexuals and so forth? And you believe they should have equal rights?
Yes, of course.
Well, because here's an interesting thing though, because I think, if you were born in Saudi Arabia or some of these other countries, you may not believe that people should have equal rights. They have a lot of different laws for women, for homosexuals, for people identifying in different ways. It sounds like maybe you shouldn't believe in equal rights then, because if you were born somewhere else, then you wouldn't believe in equal rights. Does that make sense?
Well, dang it, John, it does. But
well, let me ask you this. So we could probably go at this point, we'd say like, well, why do you believe in equal rights for human beings?
I mean, cultures are at different stages of their development, and I don't want to sound like prideful or posh about, first world countries like like the United States of America, but because we have advanced with science, because we have advanced in technology, we left those barbaric ways behind. And so we have progressed evolutionarily as a society to where we can actually, yes, we can point out to those other cultures hey, we used to be there too. We used to condone
Mm.
slavery, but now we've progressed and we see this is much better. And so,
I,
yeah, so
I think
I
you're
don't
making
know.
a good
There's a
point. Yeah,
progression.
no, I think you're making a good point about progression. And would it be safe to say that you believe we've progressed and we now have good reasons to think that we should believe in equal rights, and that's why you hold to that position? Is that a fair summary, kind of what you're getting at?
Yes, yes, we've evolved to a point where we know that that is true.
I think okay. I kind of agree with you on a lot of what you're saying there, and I would just make the same point for believing in God. It's like you started out by saying, if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you'd be a Muslim. Therefore, we shouldn't trust in Christianity. But then we got to examining, well, what about equal rights? What about these other things? Just because where we're born can affect our beliefs in things, doesn't mean we shouldn't hold certain beliefs if we have good reasons to hold them, or
Hmm.
if we progress to the point where we should hold to them. So I would say, just as you find good reasons to hold to a position like equal rights, if we have some good evidence for God and we have some good evidence for Jesus and holding to Christianity, we should be open to that as well. We shouldn't dismiss it out of hand just because we might have a different cultural upbringing. That's one thing I would point out. And then
Yeah,
if you want me to add one of the other principles I have here,
yeah,
this is
please
fun, by
do.
the way, doing it with the role play. I love it
Yes.
because you're doing a great job, because you're actually showing that the person is not going to concede the point, like that's just not what they're going to do. But like, they're going to try to further the explanation, and then you get into a deeper
Hmm.
discussion. But one of the things people will point out is that this is called like the genetic fallacy. That's the fancy term, that you can't invalidate a belief simply by citing geographical or cultural pressures, that, or by citing by citing how a person came to hold the belief. Instead, the way to invalidate it is you have to show that it's false. You actually have to give an argument for why Christianity is not false, or you have to show that there's no good reasons to hold it. Just pointing to these geographic things doesn't do it, and that's why I like to use the example of equal rights, which I got from someone. Another example you could use is atheism itself. So if we did this again, another one, and I give this in the chapter, you might say, well, hey, wait a minute, Eric, if you were born around the year 900, you would have believed in God. So does that mean, or sorry, if you were born, so I misphrased it. Let me just say it again, because I don't have my question right in front of me. The only reason you're an atheist or a secular skeptic is because you're born in the year 2020, in this high first order country. And that's the reason, because you grew up with all this wealth and this place where people can question these things. If you were born in a different part of the world, or you were born in a different time period, you wouldn't be a secular skeptic. So does that mean you shouldn't be a secularist, or you shouldn't be an atheist? And the point is, no, you can't just point to that as the reason why someone should hold that
Okay.
position. You have to look at the reasons behind it. And there's another nearby worry I go into in this chapter. If you want, we could dive into it. But a
Yeah.
nearby worry that people have is, well, what about those who never heard about Christianity? And I think
Yeah.
Catholicism actually has a good answer to that. So did you want to go into that, or do you want to push on any of those things that I said so far?
Well, we can go into that. I mean, first of all, I would say, but John, you're right. I can't invalidate just because of other people's cultures, but I'm not an atheist just because,
Mm.
or maybe I am an atheist because of my culture, but I recognize that our culture has evolved away from God. And that's just like the equal human rights thing. It's like, well, we've evolved to this state. And if I'm an atheist because of my current culture that has evolved to this state, or whether or not I'm an atheist because there's good reason to be, I think those both go hand in hand because our culture is atheistic.
Yeah, well, I don't know about that last part, because there's still
Ah,
a lot of people that believe in God. But I think the first part of what you're saying, I honestly would affirm most of that. The fact that just because we've evolved as a species, and as Catholics, we're happy to grant that God created human beings through evolution. You're not forced to hold that belief, but we're happy to answer that. We could talk about that with some more scientific objections. But I would just say those same reasons that you're pointing to, because you have good reasons, because you think it's a progression, because you think that for atheism. Well, I actually think that for theism and Catholicism. So at this point in the discussion, maybe we should go to some of those good reasons for Christian belief or for atheism, and let's compare them. And I think with all of these slogans, you're going to get to some point in the conversation where that's where you have to dive into the evidence. And in an
Yeah.
appendix, I provide like some of the evidence in an appendix, but that's not the main point of my book. The main point of my book is to show like these jumping off points
Hmm.
and help you with the conversation.
Yeah.
But yeah, at some point you're going to have to look at, well, what are the good reasons to believe in God? What are the good reasons against? And let's weigh those and see if it's worth seeking. That God exists. So that's kind of how I would go for the
Yeah.
conversation from there. But notice how we're pretty much on the same page regarding the principle of the objection.
Yes.
Neither of
Yes.
us, and this is another thing that Trent Horn does really well, you want to try to find common ground. And it sounds like the common ground we're kind of finding is that, well, we shouldn't just dismiss a belief out of hand because some people in certain regions or certain cultures happen to hold them or grow up that way. Instead, we should critically examine them and find if there's good reasons to think they're true. But the nearby worry, I think
Yeah,
people who
let's
raise this,
go into that. The nearby worry of like, well, what about all these Muslims that you're saying are going to go to
Mhm,
hell, or the Hindus,
exactly.
or I've studied Christianity and it just seems pretty intolerant to me.
And that's really where I think Catholicism has a lot to offer. Because,
All right.
I agree with you, some Christians can seem very narrow minded in this regard and might have an unnuanced view. But the Catholic tradition that I hold to, I would offer just two things that might help you with this worry. If this is really something holding you back from Christianity, from Catholicism, from believing in God, I would just ask you to consider two things. First, in the Catholic tradition, God gives all men sufficient grace to be saved, such that no one is lost by a historical or geographical accident. Now, ideally, that sufficient grace is actualized through a life of receiving sacraments, of coming into the church, of being baptized. But even the church holds that it's possible. Now, how likely this is, we don't know. We can't judge men's hearts. And that's one of the things about Catholicism. We don't go around trying to judge people like, oh, you're going to heaven, you're going to hell. No, we just don't do that. We try to love everyone and bring them into the faith and treat them well. But our tradition says that it's possible that someone who responds to God's grace in their life, even if they don't come to a knowledge of Christ and the Catholic Church explicitly in this life, they're responding to God's grace. They're asking for forgiveness. They're seeking God, their prayer. They're doing good. They're not choosing to reject Him with heinous, evil acts. Through that process, they can actually be saved through the merits of Christ and His church. So we are not saying automatically someone who's never heard about Christ or the Catholic Church automatically goes to hell. That's absolutely not what the church teaches. We teach that it's possible that they can still be saved through Christ, through God's grace, which can work outside the sacraments. That's the first main point. Second point, this is more technical, but one of the positions that some Catholics have held down the ages about like God's providence and free will is called Molinism. And it's a little bit technical, but I'll just say this as a hypothesis for someone who's struggling. Someone could say maybe God providentially ordered the world so that those who would respond to His grace and His church are born at a time and place so that they would hear it. And those who would not respond and do not respond, well, maybe they're not born at a time and place where they would get the right information, but they wouldn't have responded even if they did get that right information. And I just offer that as hypothesis. Personally, I'm not fully convinced by that view, but I think those two considerations, that God gives all men sufficient grace to be saved, and then secondly, maybe it's part of His providence that the people who need to hear about Christ and His church will hear it, and the people who don't would have rejected Him anyway. Those are two possibilities that can work strongly towards showing someone that they don't really need to worry too much
Yeah.
about this objection in particular. Now, notice it doesn't get rid of the need for evangelism, because I'm not making a certainty claim. I'm not saying like, well, just it doesn't matter what you believe, everyone goes to heaven. That's not what Catholicism teaches either. We think the primary way we want people to become Catholic Christians to be able to have that grace, because it's going to empower them to fight sin in their lives and to get holier. All I'm saying is it's not an automatic, if you're not in the church, you're not saved.
Yeah. Wow. Well, but John, there are so many different religions. How are you so sure that your religion is the right one? I mean, okay, so we have all these other religions that, yeah, sure, maybe some of them in your perspective could be saved, but why are there even so many religions? Like, why did God allow that? Or like, yeah, why is that the case?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think people have given different answers to that question down the ages. But I would just start by saying, just simple general point. Would you say that, because there's counterfeit currency, that means that would that imply that there's no real money? People have counterfeited money all the time and try to run scams with counterfeit money. Does the existence of counterfeit money mean that there's no real money?
No, but John, in different cultures, money means different things. Like if I travel to Europe before before they had that one European currency, there was every country had their own. And so, your legitimate non-counterfeit currency would not be legitimate necessarily in a different country.
That is a good point. And that is the confusion about traveling with all these currencies and these exchanges. You do have to get used to that. No, I would say that, that's a good point.
But you're right. Even within those cultures, there's a counterfeit and there's a real one. So you're right about that.
Well, all my point is we're not committed to the position as Catholics that religion, like there's no religion that we would think of that's literally wrong about everything, right? We would say that a lot of these religious impulses and different religions and different cultures, they get some things right about God. They just may not have what we would call the full expression. So here's what I would say, a couple things to get towards that. First, you already granted, since there's counterfeit money, that doesn't mean there's no real money. So we would say just because there is counterfeit religion, let's say, or religions that get things wrong, it doesn't mean that there's no correct religion. That just doesn't follow from that. Secondly, here's what I would say too as a Christian. First of all, you look down through the ages and cultures, every culture has some sort of widespread religious impulse around, different liturgies, burying their dead, prayers, and so forth. Really, every religion down through the ages has that. It's really pretty unanimous. And what we would say is the widespread religious impulse that people have, combined with the sinful nature of human beings, you have to admit, people do some pretty messed up stuff. If you combine those things together, that's how you can get false revelations, hoaxes, and even, the initiation of other religions that aren't true. So on Christianity, we believe in this widespread religious impulse, but we also believe human beings are sinful, and that can lead to the rise of a bunch of different religions. And the other thing I would say, we also believe in something called the fall, and we could talk about Adam and Eve. It doesn't have to be two people in the garden 6,000 years ago. As Catholics, we're open to, use Genesis using figurative language and so forth. But here's the idea. If there was a sin committed by our first parents that brought disharmony and disunity into the world, one of the consequences of that sin is, well, people are not going to be unified in their beliefs, and they're not going to be unified in their religious beliefs. So far from disproving Christianity, a decent amount of disharmony and disunity is actually predicted by Christianity.
Wow. Well, John, I just think my own perspective on this whole thing is that religious belief is irrational, childish, wishful thinking. It's an invention to quell our fear of death, a crutch, and really an opiate of the masses. We're all afraid of suffering, all afraid of death, and we're just afraid to look into the black hole of our own meaningless existence.
Yeah, you made a lot of criticisms there, and I feel the existential import of that criticism. I would just ask you that. I would totally follow up with questions though. It sounded like the first thing you said is that religious belief is irrational and childish. Well, what do you mean by that, and why do you think that?
Well, we've seen how other religions have kind of been disproven, like in our first conversation about the gods of the Greeks and the gods of the Romans. And it's just like they were kind of foolish to believe those things. And once again, like our society has evolved to this state where, yeah, I understand that there's people that do believe in God. But when I look at the world, it's just everyone's just afraid to die and to cling to some sort of hope that there's a resurrection. It just seems like that fills the gap. It's just like, oh, okay, well, that's nice. That would be nice. Like, I hope that that's true, honestly.
So,
but
yeah, and I get what you're saying, and I totally see that point. What I would just say though is, what you're saying doesn't seem to me to give a reason to think that it's not true. Now, maybe you have some other reasons
Hmm.
of why you think God does not exist. So we can go to that in a second. I'm totally curious to hear your other reasons. But here's why I don't just think viewing it as wishful thinking, as childish, as a way to quell our fear of death. I don't necessarily think, I don't think that shows that God doesn't exist or that he's not real or anything. Because follow me on this point. We'll see if you agree. If God exists, well, then it kind of makes sense that he would create us with sort of a homesickness or a longing for him or an idea that we want to be with him. It almost seems that if he exists, he might implant in us this sense, that we want to know him then and that this world is not enough, or even that we would have a hope of a resurrection. So my point is not that I'm not saying that prove he exists or that prove he doesn't. All I'm saying is that you're saying we shouldn't believe in God or that faith is irrational because you see a bunch of people just hoping in a resurrection to quell their fear of death. And what I would say back to that is, well, if God exists, then we might expect him to provide some religious beliefs and impulses in us as a medicine to seek him, to long for him, and to want a resurrection. So I just don't think you can say and look at that. Well, you can tell me what you think about this. I don't think you can look at that by itself and say, well, I see a bunch of people with a longing, and I just think they're afraid. As a religious person, as a Catholic, I can look at those same people and say, I see a bunch of people with a longing too. And maybe some of them are afraid, but I think God could have made us that way. So I don't think that particular criticism decides the issue one way or another. But perhaps you have some other reasons to. Here's what I would say. If you really wanted to make that decide the issue, you would need an additional reason, like to show why it's false. You would have to give some good reasons why you think atheism is true, Catholicism is false. And I would have to say, I need to give some good reasons to think that there actually is a resurrection and that God does exist. I'm just saying pointing out or claiming that it's irrational or that it's hopeful or that it's
Hmm.
wishful thinking, that doesn't decide the issue one way or the other.
Well, John, here's why I think it's wishful thinking to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ in particular. If he raised from the dead bodily, as you claim, where is he? Like, shouldn't we see him?
Well,
Didn't he, or why did he float off to heaven or something? Like,
yeah. So here's the thing about it. And I would ask you, if there's an actual conversation, I'd love to hear, what you've looked into regarding the resurrection and what you have seen about it. Because even a very famous atheist in the 20th century, Anthony Flew at the time, said the resurrection evidence is different in quantity and quality than any other miracle in any religion. So we could look at that in a second. But first I would just say, well, if he did rise from the dead, then we would expect people to see him. And we do have that. We have very early testimony of credible witnesses who claim to see Jesus alive after his resurrection. We could talk about some of that evidence. And you might say, oh, well, that's just stuff in the Bible. Well, actually, we have some historical facts that are acknowledged by a wide majority of scholars that Jesus died, that he was that various disciples saw him alive after his resurrection, that the tomb was found empty, and that the origins of the Christian belief that people came to believe in him, they came to that came to be very widespread. They were even willing to become martyrs for his sake. In other words, we can investigate that evidence. But to answer your quick question, like where is he? Well, our teaching is that he did ascend into heaven. So he ascended out of our realm and he can't be seen anymore. And you might just say, oh, well, how convenient, right?
isn't that
That he
convenient?
ascended. Yeah. Isn't that convenient? And I would say, well, you can view it as convenient, but you could also view it as true. And to really know whether this occurred or not, we're going to have to do the hard work of digging into it and doing some historical investigation. And I'll tell you what, through my investigation, I've only found the resurrection to be a strong reason to be a Christian. And I don't think any of the objections against it are very good. But maybe that's something we can look at in a second dialogue. Or if this were conversation, I might even refer people to our round table that we did,
Yeah.
the resurrection and some of that evidence, because people are going to have to consider this. And you'll notice we've kind of bounced around to a lot of different things. And in a regular conversation, sometimes you can do this and you can bounce around to a lot of objections, but sometimes it can also be helpful to say, hey, well, let's table that concern for now. And let's go deeper into, what are your good reasons to think that God doesn't exist? And I'll give you some reasons to think that God does exist. And then we'll go from there.
And ultimately, that's what it comes down to for me, John, is that there's a big if, and I don't see enough evidence for God's existence. Like, to me, it seems like faith is irrational because there's just no evidence for it. I mean, yeah, you supplied some of those things, but I do think that those apostles were just wishful thinkers. But even just a deeper layer, the reason why I don't believe that is because I don't believe God exists. And I don't believe that because I don't see any evidence. And as Russell's teapot would acclaim, absence of evidence is evidence of absence.
By the way, I love how you're just weaving in. If people are looking at the table of contents, you're like weaving in like 13 of the slogans. This is absolutely incredible.
I'm making it extra challenging for you, John. That's
no, but
all.
what I would say to that is, well, hey, you say there's no evidence for God's existence. Let me ask you, what's the best evidence you've heard, and what do you think is wrong with it?
For God's non-existence?
Well, no. That's
or
not
for
the
God's
question. All right,
existence?
you said, and this you got to get clear on this in the discussion. You said you don't believe in God because you don't think there's any evidence for his existence.
Yeah.
My question is, well, what's the best evidence you've heard, and what do you think is wrong with it?
Well, I think the best evidence I've heard is, we know from science, as of right now at least, that the Big Bang Theory is true, in which case there's a start to the universe. And so the best evidence that I see is that people claim that has to be some sort of cause to the universe. But the way I think of it is, well, there could be multiverses. There could be multiple universes that kind of go, one starts the other starts the other, and there's this like reciprocal multiverse that is eternal. And so, yes, our universe, it obviously shows that there's a beginning, but that was maybe caused by this other universe that was caused by this other one. But then when you put them all together, it creates an eternal universe. And I know that sounds weird, but maybe we'll evolve in our society to where our science will actually point that is now the case.
So, first of all, I commend you for looking into this, because it sounds like you've at least studied, some of the evidence before. Because I'll tell you what, I've asked that question to a lot of people, like, what's the best evidence you've heard? And sometimes they just say they haven't heard any evidence at all. But it sounds like you've at least put some on the table, and I want to credit you for that. But I would say let's explore that further. It sounds like we were pointing out with the beginning of the universe is something called the Kalam cosmological argument. Have you heard that before? Is that kind of what you're referencing?
I have, but please refresh my memory.
So that's the, Kalam cosmological argument is one of the famous arguments for God's existence, and I happen to think it's pretty good. It goes back to the Middle Ages and Islamic philosophers and Christians, and they would argue something like this: like, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. And then we could do a conceptual analysis of what that cause is like, and maybe we can get to that in a little bit. But it sounds like you actually agree with the first part of that argument, that you think there's some good reasons to think the universe began to exist and therefore has a cause for its existence. You just have a couple extra worries about pushing it back to a step to some sort of multiverse, or
right. Yeah, I know that our universe, certainly, but that doesn't mitigate the possibility of a multiverse or multiple dimensions in the universe to also like cause that existence. So it doesn't have to be God.
That's a good point. I think that's something worth addressing. And I think a lot of philosophers have done a lot of great work on this, and they kind of call stage one the idea of getting to something that is the cause of the universe. And then stage two, give some reasons for why thinking that is God. Maybe we can go into that, but I just want to make sure I'm following on stage one, because here's what I would also offer you. Some people point to a multiverse as, an explanation of like our universe. But what you can do is, and there's been some great scientific work done on this, I'll refer you to Father Robert Spitzer, who is actually a Catholic priest and a physicist. And he's done some work on these different theorems and theoretical physics and so forth. If you really want to dive into this, I think there's good reasons there. And he shows that even the multiverse itself could not have been past eternal. Even if you look at if you look at the Big Bang Theory, you look at different models, and people have different actually conceptions of what they mean by multiverse and if you press it. But I would say even if you look at that itself, it actually couldn't have been eternal in the past. It all points to a beginning point. And if we believe even that had a beginning, and we think that things that begin to exist have a cause, well, then we're going to need to do some kind of analysis as to what that cause is like. And there's also, and maybe we don't have time to go into these now, but there's actually also good philosophical arguments to show that time can't be past eternal, that there actually has to be a beginning point, some point in the past, whether you believe in it's this universe, whether it's the multiverse, there's still going to be some sort of absolute beginning. And that's not just me saying it, that's actually a pretty common view. I would say the majority opinion, and I can give you some citations on this, of physicists. So given that beginning, let's think about what that cause should be like. If the multiverse and the universe and so forth contains all space, time, matter, and energy, if it contains all that stuff, we have to think for a second. If this cause transcends the reality that we know, well, then it would seem like it has to be something that's not made of matter, that's not, extended in space like our universe is, and that is not in time because it would have been prior to time in some sense as being its creator. So that would be the first
Hmm.
step I would take you on that. I would just say, hey, what do you think about that? The idea that whatever's behind, if there is something, because it sounds like you do kind of grant there's something. Now, sometimes when people see where this is going, they might not grant this anymore. But it sounds like you do kind of are willing to entertain a first cause of some sort. And I would just say, what do you think about that first cause? Would you be willing to agree that it's either non-material, that it is transcending time in some way, and that it's not in space in some way? Otherwise, it couldn't have, because if it existed in those things, then it couldn't have been prior to them. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if that guy Father Spitzer is correct about the multiverse also in totality having a beginning, then it does in fact seem like this, whatever is the cause,
Mm.
if you want to call it God or whatever, maybe it's just like some sort of force. But
Well, actually, let me press you on that because I think that's a good point. People usually go to a force or something.
okay,
I actually think there's a reason we can think that it's not just a force. Um, but I totally get that. That's actually a very reasonable position to hold, and I want to commend you again for looking into this because maybe we can agree at this point on this conversation. Would you say, like, if God exists, that that's a pretty incredible truth, and if Christianity and Catholicism is true, that that's something pretty powerful that you would want to know, and maybe even want to enter into a relationship with God, so that he literally teaches that he might turn your life upside down in some ways, but getting to know him and how he loves you and his plan for your life could be one of the greatest things of all time. Would you at least think like it could be a very good thing if God exists?
I mean, actually, now that you're saying that, that would be kind of crazy to think that if there is a God that started this universe, that I could actually know him and like be known by him. That's crazy because like I don't even
Yeah.
know the president. He's pretty powerful. So
And honestly, this is like a good testing the waters question because most atheists are not going to say that. If they're this is kind of like check if they're open or not open. If they really don't even like the idea at all that God could exist, then part of what we're going to have to do in the conversation is provide some value to that idea and show them the goodness of Christianity, not just what it can do for folks in this life,
hmm,
the charity that people have done, the holiness of our saints. It would be great to have some examples of those, but also what it can mean for them and what it can
yes,
actually do for them. So, because if you ask that question, like, well, would you want there to be a God or would you want to know him and so forth? And you just get like a dead no, like that's disgusting, like it repulses me and so forth. Then there's going to need to be some tilling of the soil to open that person up, some grace, pray for them, of course,
yeah,
but showing, because maybe no one's ever shown them how Christianity could be good. Maybe they only ever confronted people who were arrogant, who were angry, who were saying that everyone else
hmm,
is going to hell and so forth. So you got to show some of that value. But where I was going with the force thing, sorry, I got
yes,
off a tangent.
yes. No, that's great.
So people would say it's a force. I think there's a good reason to think that the cause would be personal or something at least analogous to something that is personal. And here's why. Imagine for a moment this transcendent cause of the universe. We've been talking about the Kalam cosmological argument. Whatever's at that beginning, whatever brings it all into existence, suppose it was just some kind of impersonal force. If that's the case, then it would have to stand outside of space and time. Okay, you follow me on that? And all of the antecedent present conditions for bringing about the universe would have already been present in this impersonal cause, in an impersonal way, in this force. It would already have everything that it needs to create the universe. Why does that have to be true? Well, if it didn't have everything it needs to create the universe, then it couldn't have created the universe. So it needs to have all the power, we could say, or the stuff
Hmm.
and the antecedent ability to create. Would you follow me on that part? That it's going to
Yeah.
need to have all that stuff. Okay. So then here's the next step. Why then, if it already had everything needed to create the universe, then why hasn't the universe, or if you want to say multiverse, why hasn't that always existed? Why hasn't it been eternal? Because if this thing that had all that power, all that ability, all that stuff, if it already had it all packed into itself in an impersonal way, some kind of impersonal force, it seems inexplicable why the universe wouldn't have just always existed alongside of it. How would
Hmm.
it switch from it not existing to it existing? And here's where I want to offer you a hypothesis. We can get out of this conundrum, this inexplicability, if the impersonal force is actually not impersonal, if it has something analogous to choice and it can choose to bring the universe into existence. That actually would make sense for the reason behind why the multiverse begins to exist or why the universe begins to exist. And it points to the personality of the cause. So I actually think we have some good reasons to think there's a transcendent cause of the universe. It's non-physical, non-material, it's not in space, and it's plausibly personal. And that to me sounds like we're on the way towards God. It's not the only reason anyone has proposed. I would love to offer you some more evidence. Perhaps in another conversation, we could talk about some of the
Yeah.
fine tuning evidence, the moral argument, and so forth. But hopefully, I know I probably haven't convinced you, but maybe I've given you a start to at least think that there could be something there when it comes to God's existence.
I would say I'm cautiously open, John. So thank you for cracking the door of my soul open ever so slightly today.
Very good. Well, it's
John,
been great talking to you.
yes, you did so amazing. Like, wow, this is awesome. And just want to
Well,
encourage
you know what I
everyone.
love that you did, because
Yeah.
this is really, it's much harder, and this is kind of fun. Like as Catholics in our small groups, we could do this kind of role play and like
Yeah.
just giving our reasons and such. Because I'll say some of the things I think I did okay, but some of them, what I wasn't aware that you did so well is you like intertwined the slogans together. And that's kind of when it's tougher when, because you brought up like evolution a lot and like the science objection. I got a whole chapter on people who are like, well, I don't believe in God. I just believe in science. But a lot of times people don't just say that, they intertwine it with like a couple of other objections. But hopefully, I at least modeled a little bit how you can ask some questions to
Yeah.
clarify the objections and then offer something more.
Yeah, and I want to ask forgiveness for all the listeners out there who might be atheist, agnostic, whatever you might be. And I was providing a caricature for sure. Like
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
trying to get the conversation rolling. So I don't believe that everyone out there would articulate these things the way that I've done it today. I'm just trying to get the role play out there. Um, but yeah, John. So once again, just brief. Where can people find you, and a little bit more about the book? Where can they get that and all
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. Well, and I would say this book is nice because it's a popular level. Anybody can pick this up, read it, and get something from it. Head over to classicaltheism.com/new book. But if you also want to check out the Classical Theism podcast, I bring on people who are a lot more expert than me in this area, and we literally just conduct interviews, and I press them like Eric is doing to me on good reasons to think that God exists, that Jesus is our Lord and Messiah, and that he founded the Catholic Church. And we bring on some of the great experts in philosophy and history to hopefully buttress the Catholic position, because we think there's great value in this, and we want more people to become Catholic and come to know and love our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, John.
Thanks, Eric.